Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being at this session about Adopters Welcome. Humane World for Animals is a national animal protection organization. You might know us formerly as the Humane Society of the United States. And over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm so excited to talk to you about this program and how it might benefit the pets and the people that you're trying to connect with in your community. So first, we're going to talk about what Adopters Welcome is, in case you haven't heard of it. And even if you are somewhat familiar with it, this might be a great refresher on some of the pieces that we're really focused on when we're building this framework for shelters and rescues. We're going to talk about why we need it. Why would we need a framework for adoption that functions this way? And then I'll give a few tips about how to start removing barriers for adopters at each step of your process. Just know that in our full curriculum for this training, this could be an entire day-long conversation. So my hope today is just to give you some high-level things to consider, and then, of course, to follow up if you have any if you need any of our resources to sort of dig in a little bit more. And at the end, I'm going to tell you a few tips on how to begin if it feels overwhelming, or even if you're an organization that has really embraced conversation-based adoptions, maybe there's some tweaks that you can make to make the process even better for adopters. So what is Adopters Welcome? This is a framework that Humane World for Animals encourages for shelters and rescues as a way to really embrace all community members in your area who are interested in pet adoption. We believe very strongly that anybody who wants the love of a pet is deserving of that love, that things like socioeconomic opportunities or where somebody lives or whether they rent their home, that those are things that should not prohibit people from having the love of a pet. And one of the biggest parts of this framework is that we really want to be having conversations with adopters rather than leaning on these paper applications that likely have a lot of yes/no questions instead of open-ended questions for people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, about how you build in conversations into your process. And something that I don't know that we always think about when we're thinking about connecting adopters with pets is that we really want animal shelters and rescue organizations to be the place that pet owners come to when they are struggling, when they have questions about pet care. Of course, veterinarians and other experts in your community may serve some of that purpose. But by building long-term relationships with potential adopters, we will then allow for a trusting relationship where they will come back to us when they have behavior questions, when they have medical veterinary needs for their pet, if they run into a time of crisis in their life and they just need some support and some brainstorming about how they might be able to keep their pet. So we really see adoption as the very beginning of a long-lasting relationship with potential adopters. And so before we dive into the content, I just want you to kind of pause and think about maybe you yourself has had an experience with pet adoption that didn't go as well as you had hoped. If you're like me, you've even been denied adopting an animal. And so this might hit you sort of personally, but also from an organizational standpoint, when you think about your organization's adoption process, would you, as an individual, be able to adopt from your shelter or rescue? And this is such a good exercise to sort of remind ourselves that even as people who are in this field that understand the process, that there might still be barriers for us that would prohibit us from adopting either from our own organizations or from organizations that we work with in our communities. And so just pause for a second and think about how have you felt in this adoption experience? And if you work at an animal shelter, we get a little bit of privilege because we're exposed to all those pets who are coming in. And so likely you might be somebody who just took home the last animal who came in and you had an attachment to, but you know that for the public, they go through a very different process. So why do we need to think about building relationships with adopters, having conversations with them, listening to what they're really looking for in a new pet, when, people seem to be able to adopt the way that we've been doing things for a long time? And this data is coming from the US. And so you may have some data in your area that helps you to understand the competition. But we know in the US that people are acquiring their pets not always from shelters and rescues. And some of these categories are perfectly fine, right? Like many people have taken on a pet of a friend or a relative, somebody who was in crisis and they needed to rehome their pet. Plenty of community members step up and help each other in this way. So that friend relative category, certainly there's no issue with that. What we hope for is that those folks still have access to animal shelters, veterinarians, folks who can help them with that animal through that transition if they do run into issues. But when it comes to either the breeder category or even more so in this day and age, the ability for people to just go online and purchase a puppy, get that puppy delivered right to their door without many questions asked, we know that we are in direct competition with puppy mills, with companies that make this really barrier-free. And we really want to see some of this percentage go up for shelters and rescues. So, because we have so many animals who need to be placed. And so when we're thinking about our adoption process, for sure, we want to center the relationship we have with adopters, but also think about all the people who aren't actually calling their local shelter or going on the website or figuring out if pet adoption is even going to be something that they can do. And they're either trying and not succeeding, and so they're skipping to a different kind of pet acquisition, or maybe they're not trying at all because they get to a website and they see tons of barriers in front of them. They don't think they're going to be approved, and so they just head someplace else. And when we're thinking about the way that adopters come to our organizations, of course, for many people, that process starts way before they ever come in contact with us. So somebody may be considering adopting a pet. They may be doing all kinds of research online and on websites before they decide, okay, adoption is probably right for me. This is the kind of pet that I'm looking for. And then they get to that phase where they're reaching out and they're contacting a shelter or rescue. We know that the public is understandably confused when there's tens of thousands of shelters and rescues. And so when they have a negative experience at one organization, it can be something that they extrapolate to all kinds of organizations. So when they contact you for the first time, just sort of trying to understand your process, or what should they bring when they come in the first time? What are your hours? If you're a foster-based organization, how do they meet the pets that are in foster care? The way that they are treated in that moment, even just in terms of getting a call back or having a conversation, can really drive the rest of this. And so assuming that that all has gone well, they've come into an organization, they've met an animal that they believe might be a good fit, they have the adoption conversation, and that's what this Adopters Welcome program is really focused on. And then hopefully they leave with their new pet, and then you are there for them into the future with that animal if they run into any challenges. This is how we want this to go. This is, of course, not always how it goes. And so we have a disconnect. Again, this is data from the United States, but we know from multiple surveys that over half of Americans would prefer to adopt a cat or a dog from a shelter or rescue. And yet only about a third of them actually do. And so the more that we can dig into the barriers, the reasons people may not adopt, even if that was their first choice, the more that we can untangle some of the kind of unnecessary, but also barriers that seep into our process over time, that is human nature, and how do we sort of push back against that and create a culture that keeps things open. So when we deny adoptions, and your organization may or may not completely deny folks, you may send folks out to sort of get more prepared for having a pet. They may just leave feeling judged. They may never have gotten to the stage that they came into your organization because the website seemed too judgmental. But when we deny an adoption, it of course creates a big ripple effect. So whether that's that the animal stays longer, even if you're in a foster-based rescue, you know that the longer a cat or dog stays in your foster homes, the fewer animals that you can help over time. But in a shelter setting, the longer they stay, the more exposed they may be to contagious illness or behavioral deterioration. And of course, for every day that an animal stays, we spend money on them. We spend the animal care funds. So We think about this from the pet perspective, but then we also think about this from the adopter perspective in terms of where they may go next. Are they completely cut off from our other safety net programs that we may have because they had a poor adoption experience? And then, I don't know if you all have seen all those memes on social media, but adoption has sort of gotten this stigma that you have to be completely perfect on paper and in person to be able to walk away with a senior cat. And so we have to sort of push back against this stigma that pet adoption is really complicated, that people are either going to pass or fail our guidelines for whether they can be adopters. And that's what this program is all about. So I'm going to give a few examples of where you might have barriers, you may not, that you might want to think about removing those barriers. And I'm giving just a sampling of some things that we usually see, but I would love to chat about what barriers you might be experiencing and how to navigate those. So the first thing is that adoption requirement. When I see a lengthy adoption application, which is the application I worked from for many years when I was working in animal sheltering, I know that we had a bunch of yes, nos, and if somebody responded the wrong way to those questions, it meant that we were either going to deny them or we were going to sort of give them the runaround. And so when we have policies that are yes, no, very often they are coming from a place of fear. And I don't want to discount that fear. Many of us have experienced hard situations in this work where things did not go the way that we had hoped in an adoption. Sometimes they go traumatically. And so when we don't have a culture of processing and working through those stressful situations, it can lead to, well, maybe I can just avoid this thing from happening in the future by having a new question on the adoption application. And when you talk with organizations, they'll often say, like, I don't know why we ask this thing. This has been around for 8 years. Nobody who developed this question is still working at the shelter. And so sometimes we don't even know why we're asking the questions we are, and it sometimes can come from that place of fear or something that might have happened in the past. But when you actually look at the volume of animals that shelters and rescues are placing into homes, the number of situations in which something doesn't go well are so small, but our brains, because they are wired for negativity bias, they latch onto those bad situations, and then we try to prevent them at all costs. And so those restrictive policies can limit the options that animals have. It excludes potential adopters, and it creates a lot of unnecessary barriers where a conversation with somebody might be able to get to a yes. And these are just a few examples that we see. There's many. I think I made a list of like 40 that I have seen. And one of them that tends to come up pretty often is this requirement that if people are renting their apartment or their home, that they have to have proof from their landlord that they are allowed to have pets, or in some cases, we're calling those property owners and we're asking them to confirm that somebody can have an animal. It takes a ton of staff time to be able to do things like that. And in Adopters Welcome, we approach the rental challenges from the place of trusting the adopters. So in the US in particular, housing is an incredibly discriminatory system that we have where the people who are most likely to rent, who may be living in areas that have really restrictive pet policies or unfair policies that get thrown into a rental lease, where they don't have the power to be able to stand up to their landlord when those rules change, we want to make sure that they can still adopt. And I feel really strongly that if we're going to be calling landlords and property owners, it is so that we can advocate for that person and that pet, and we can say to them, listen, your 50 pound weight limit or your 2 cat limit that you have in your apartment is really keeping us from doing this really beautiful adoption with someone. Another example is indoor cats, where somebody might say, yep, my last cat was indoor outdoor. I really love that she gets all this enrichment and exercise when she goes outside. And what we hear is like, danger, danger, danger. And then we deny somebody. They're still going to get a cat. It's not like us denying them is going to prevent them from doing that. And we've missed an opportunity to have a conversation about exercise and enrichment in the home, Do you want to build a catio for your next cat so they can get some fresh air in a safe way? We have some really energetic cats who would love to get walked on a leash. There are solutions to this that aren't a simple no. And then the last common one tends to be sort of this check that either the pets at home have vaccinations and are spayed and neutered, or their previous pets have been. And we know that access to veterinary care is a really systemic barrier for many people. So instead of a denial of an adoption, can we offer them free vaccines for the pets they have at home? Can we connect them with a veterinary clinic that does low-cost spay neuter and try to get all the pets in the family up to date and spayed and neutered? So there's solutions here as opposed to sort of a one-off rejection. And I'll just mention, we use a lot of data in Adopters Welcome. We use a lot of research. And this is an example of how we have a conversation about something like landlord checks. So an Ohio shelter in the US ended their strict landlord check policy and found no difference in the number of pets who were returned or were kept by their families. Their return rates were very small. And then also, when we as organizations guess at dog breeds, we often are putting the renter in sort of an even more tricky position, because we know that landlords are often discriminating against perceived breeds like pit bull type dogs. So we encourage folks not to make guesses about dog breeds when you're working, particularly when you're working with renters, but for anybody. And many of the questions we ask in adoption applications are a point in time for someone. So in the US, people move about 11 times in their life. I moved 11 times in 8 years. So if I had gone through an adoption process and somebody had checked with my landlord, I was out of that place in like 9 months during a phase of my life where I was moving around a lot. So what we know about someone in a moment is not, of course, what is necessarily going to be their life for the life of the pet that we're adopting to them. And I would just encourage you all to do a little bit of data. There's lots of ways to do data on this. But one way is to look at the percentage of your service area, your community that you serve, and what percentage of them has adopted in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. And if it's 35% and under, you're about at the average or less in the United States. And if you are over that, then you're probably doing a better job than the average. But we often find, especially when we map this data, we find that we are often adopting to the exact same neighborhoods, and we are missing entire categories and service areas of our community that could benefit from pet adoption. So I've talked a bit about long applications. Even if the questions are well-intended, when somebody sees like a 6-page application, they immediately are like, oh gosh, like either I don't have time to do this, or I know I'm just going to get rejected, so I'm not going to put the energy in. And those using paperwork to build a relationship just doesn't work. So how can we shift to something like a questionnaire that is short? It gets to what is the person looking for in a new pet? How can we support them in having a pet like that? And so we don't miss these opportunities with them. And then don't forget that paper applications or applications that you have on your website are not accessible to everybody. Folks who don't have strong Wi-Fi, who may not have internet access, people who need some assistance, have English as a second language. Anybody who isn't going to be able to sort of go online and fill out an application, you're losing them as a potential adopter. And those yes/no questions or those short answers, they really discourage adopters from disclosing the challenges that they may be facing, where you all could fill that gap for them. So one of the resources I'm going to provide is a sample questionnaire. It's very straightforward. It literally just asks people about themselves, their household, and what they're looking for in a pet. What I encourage organizations to do, especially if you're moving from a really lengthy application to a shorter one, is just start to work through what are the questions that you don't usually even ask anybody. Maybe there's a question on your current application that you don't even use most of the time. Start there and kind of take the easiest part out and then start to work on some of the questions that you're less comfortable getting rid of. And then I just want to point out that adoption marketing, the ability to reach folks to encourage them to come in for adoption, is definitely worthy of our time, both in terms of Are we open to the public during hours that they can actually access us? If somebody is working 2 jobs or they're working a normal 9 to 5, is your shelter or rescue available in the evening? Is it available on the weekends? Do you have enough people to be able to have conversations with folks when it's time for them to adopt? And we always include this in our conversations about Adopters Welcome because it can be easy to say, have conversations with adopters, see what they're looking for, help them out if they're struggling. But we know that shifting from a place of sort of this yes/no questionnaire to a real conversation, it takes time. And it takes the ability for the team to sort of help each other out. And so we are very heavy in this program about how to support staff and volunteers, where open communication is encouraged, feedback is constant. So if you are working with a family and you're not really sure if the dog that they're interested in is going to be a great match, but you're trying to stay open to it, you tag in a team member to give you some objective feedback to be able to work on, okay, if you're uncomfortable with this, like let's say the dog is super high energy, they've been looking for a lap dog, how can you have a conversation that doesn't leave them feeling disappointed and judged, but helps them to find a better match? And then I can't emphasize enough to my earlier point about negativity bias and the hard things that happen in this work. When we don't have resources to deal with the stress and sometimes the trauma that happens in this work, we are going to try to create systems that protect our nervous systems. And so we really have to have support for staff and volunteers if things don't go well, or maybe you're just afraid things won't go well, even if nothing bad has happened yet. And really overly celebrate all the successes, because the only way that you can push back against negativity bias in our brains is to say all the positive stuff all the time. There's some rule out there that you have to say 10 positive things for every 1 negative experience that you're having. It's no different with adoptions, right? And making sure that the people who are doing the counseling, whether they're volunteers or paid staff, that they feel knowledgeable, they feel confident in their skills, because when they can truly be a resource for people, that's how we build confidence in the entire program. And how do you navigate complicated conversations? How do you include training for all team members that makes them feel supported and valued? And so I will just say that there's a lot of ways to start, depending on where you're at in this journey to begin with. One thing that I recommend is think of everything as a pilot. So if you are thinking, you know what, I'm really tired of calling all these landlords, they barely call us back, we wait 3 days to hear back from someone before we can adopt out an animal. Let's look at our data on how many animals have been returned for housing restrictions and do a pilot where we get rid of that check for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And we keep track of how many folks couldn't figure out their housing and the animal needed to come back. How many folks did we have to advocate for? Did that add extra time to the staff? And did they have time to do that now that they weren't doing landlord checks on everybody? So think of everything as a pilot, and also start with something easy. So if there is a requirement you have now that you feel really strongly needs to stay in place, that's okay. We're not asking everybody to rip the Band-Aid off and start from scratch here. Start with something that everyone's sort of like, I don't really know why we ask this or why we do this as part of our process. And then test it out for a few months, get a little bit comfortable with something new, and then come back to the next thing that you might be able to work on. So start small, try some pilots, ask adopters. So go to your community and ask them, what has prevented you from adopting and how can we better support you? And I'll end with some training resources, which we've included in the platform. But if you go to humanepro.org, which is our website for animal welfare professionals, and you look at the Adopters Welcome page, you'll find the full training manual, an adoption questionnaire, some other handouts that can be helpful. And then we have a longer webinar series that comes with a certificate, as well as some continuing education credits. Thank you so much for your time.